my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and this is, at long last, my 5-star reads of 2022. I'm not going to get into explanations and excuses for why this video is so late, I'm just going to get into the video. Now, overall, my reading in 2022 was dramatically improved over the previous year, and really not just the previous year 2021, but also the year 2020 as well. I read 48 books in 2022, which is up from 31 in 21 and 45 in 2020. And my number of pages, according to the Goodreads page count, also well surpassed my page count for both of the previous years. So the question is, Kelsey, did this increased quantity of reading lend itself to a more substantial list of 5-star reads than last year? You'll remember last year was a very disappointing list of 5-star reads for me. I only had 5 books on that list, and those 5 came from only 2 different series with arguably 2 rereads. So while it is disappointing for me to report that with the increased number of books that I read in 2022, I still have only 5-star reads from the year. I take a lot of encouragement from the fact that these were books from 5 different authors, one of whom was new to me in 2022, and there are 4 different series represented as well as 1 standalone. That said, I do wish these 5-star experiences had been more evenly distributed throughout the year. I started out really strong at the beginning of 2022. I had 1 5-star read each in January, February, and March. And then I had a long slog before finally hitting another 5-star read right at the end of November, and then the final one in December. So I am going to go through these books in the order that I read them and tell you a little bit about why each of them was a 5-star read for me personally. The first is A Conspiracy of Kings by Whalen Turner. This is the 4th book in the Queen's Thief series, and the first 4 books in this series were all 5-star reads. And this book follows a character, Sophos, who was my favorite side character in the first book in the series, so I had been waiting in anticipation to get to this book, knowing that this was his book. I had a lot of expectations going into this, and I was not disappointed. This is a story about a character who goes through a lot of painful experiences and grows to become a person who meets the moment when he is called upon to do so. This series is very politically driven fantasy in a sort of pseudo-Mediterranean setting. It is very light on the magic and very strong in its characters. So if A Conspiracy of Kings was a book that met my very high expectations, the next book is one that exceeded my expectations, and that is Winterkeep by Kristin Cashore, which is the 4th book in the Graceling Realm series. Both of these first 2 are book number 4 in a series, but they're the only 2 that are book number 4. Fans of the Graceling Realm series believed that it had ended in 2012 with Bitterblue, and readers who loved these books when we were younger were maybe a little nervous about whether Kristin Cashore really could add to this series in a way that was fully satisfactory, and boy did she ever. The first 3 books in this YA fantasy series were all companion novels, sort of, with completely different protagonists. Book 3, Bitterblue, was my personal favorite in the original trilogy, and I gave that book 4 stars. I liked the original books when I read them, I think back in 2016, which was several years after they'd been published. But I never 5-star loved them, and so this was such a delightful surprise for me. Honestly, I really should have probably gone back and reread Bitterblue before reading this book. Bitterblue herself remains a major point of view character in this book, as does Gideon, who was in the previous books as well. And while I remember quite a bit about Bitterblue herself, because she is possibly my favorite character in the series, I didn't really remember enough of the details about some of the characters who are close to her in her orbit. And while certainly enough was explained that I never felt like I was lost in this book, I also felt like I might have loved it even more than I did if I had remembered more of the details about some of these people. What's really interesting to me here is that at this point in the story, Bitterblue is no longer a teenager, but there is a new major teenage protagonist in this book as well, who provides such an interesting counterpoint to Bitterblue as someone who is sort of maybe older and wiser and has some wisdom to offer to this younger person. So I think in that way, this author has really sort of invited both readers who were teenagers when the original books were released, as well as new readers who are teens now, to be able to come together and both be able to fully appreciate and experience this book, because I think each of those demographics will have a character in this book that they can relate to. In addition to that being very cleverly done for a YA series that's being picked up again years later, this is a book that expands the world of the Graceling Realm series in a way that sort of confronts and challenges some of the sort of assumptions and genre limitations that the author was maybe unconsciously working within in the earlier books. There is a whole new continent, and they have some different technology, and they have some different political systems. They also have some different sorts of magic, and one of the constant through lines in this series from the very beginning has been sort of the ethical implications of different types of mind magic. And that's a continued thread here, but in a different way, which is really great. There are also a couple of very endearing non-human point of view characters, and there's just so much to love about this book, so much to love for both adult readers and teenage readers, I think. So this is, I think, a very successful continuation to a series. My third book on this list, which I read in March, is another one that exceeded any and all expectations that I had of it, and this was Lagoon Fire by Francesca Forrest. This is a novella, a fantasy novella that flew very much under the radar when it was released due to it being from a small press. This is a sequel to an even shorter novelette called The Inconvenient God. This series is called Tales of the Polity. Both books have the same protagonist, but I really don't think you need to read the first book in order to read this one at all. They are both standalone stories. They follow a woman who works for the government as a decommissioner of old gods who are no longer worshipped. And they both follow decommissioning cases where matters are much more complicated than the government would perhaps like to admit. Unlike the first book, though, this one gets deeply, deeply personal for the protagonist in a way that made me genuinely emotional and emotionally invested in a way I was not at all expecting based on how I had felt about the first book. In this case, Sweeting, also known as Decommissioner 37, is investigating a case that ends up turning up some history that is connected to her own backstory and also is not how she was taught that it happened. The first book had some sort of subtle undertones of questioning authority in it. This goes much further with all of that commentary. I genuinely think this is a book that could have been extremely popular in the SFF community if it had come out from a bigger publisher, and I am sort of begging more people to read this. And then after my long drought of no 5-star reads in the middle of the year, in November, I finally read Netherland Bone by T. Kingfisher. I have read, I do not know how many T. Kingfisher books, or books by Ursula Vernon / T. Kingfisher, because she uses both names, hoping and waiting for the book that would finally be a 5-star read. And each book of hers that I've read that is so close but not quite has left me wondering more and more if it would ever happen, because I was originally, when I started reading her books, pretty sure that it would. This is it. This is the first 5-star T. Kingfisher book for me. So this is a relatively short, standalone, dark fairy tale novel. It's interesting. I've heard people describe this book both as very dark and very cozy. And I sort of want to say that it's both, that it starts out in a very, very dark place and eventually builds to a place of hope. This has a smattering of all of the elements that I like in T. Kingfisher's other books that haven't always necessarily been combined in exactly the right proportions for me in those other books that I've read. This is using some fairy tale archetypes. It has some, you know, weird, dark creepiness. It has some sort of extremely original comedy. It has an endearing cast of characters. It has just a little bit of romance of a type that's very distinctly T. Kingfisher-ish, but the romance is like not even slightly the focus of this book. It's very, very secondary. There's a demon chicken, like everything you sort of want and expect from a T. Kingfisher book. It's here, and I recommend this if you're looking for a place to start with her adult books specifically. I think if you're looking for a place to start with her more YA or middle grade-ish books, I would recommend A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking. But if you're looking for some place to start with T. Kingfisher's adult books, I would recommend this one. And then I would say, based on what it is you most like about this, you will know where to go next with her books. Like if you really love the romance, like you can go read the romance novels. If you really love like the darker, creepier fairy tale stuff, you can go read you can go read The Seventh Bride. If you really like some of the cozier stuff, then maybe read some of the middle grade novels. If you like the occasional moment when things get really messed up, I don't know, go read the horror novels. I haven't read any of those because that's not what I like. This is published by Tor, and I think it's her first traditionally published adult book that isn't horror. And given that I don't read the horror books, so the books I'm comparing this to in my mind are the indie published ones, I think this definitely stands out as feeling more well-rounded and complete in a way, possibly more polished. This is about a princess who discovers that her two older sisters have been horrifically abused by a powerful prince, and she sets out gathering allies on a quest to murder him. And then my final 5-star read of the year was in December, and this is the one that I'm probably going to talk about least here because my next planned video is a series review of the entire series that this book belongs to. This is A Rake of His Own by A.J. Lancaster, which is a spin-off novel in the Stariel series, which are fantasy of manners with fae romance and some I would say gradually building, escalating political and magical plot that happens over the course of 4 books. The main 4 books focus on mostly one romantic couple, and this is the book where we finally get the story of the secondary romantic couple. I said that this series is fantasy of manners, say romance. I would categorize this one slightly differently. This is a fae romance murder mystery. The author advertises this one as a standalone spin-off that you can read without reading the other books, and I would see why that's good marketing if you want to sell a book that is set after your main series. However, I would recommend reading this after the main series because I think that for me, a good deal of the satisfaction that I got out of reading this book came from my pre-existing emotional investment in these characters. So while this is the only book in this series that I've actually given 5 stars on its own, I would say that this is a 5-star rating that for me is somewhat symbolic of my overall enjoyment of the series to which this book belongs. This series was my comfort read of the year. This was my favorite new to me author of the year. For me, these were delightful cotton candy books. I finished each one desperate to pick up the next. I can see why they might not be for everyone, so look forward to my series review coming soon on this channel. Anyways, so there you have it. Those were my 5-star reads of 2022. What do you think? Is the number of 5-star books kind of pathetic for how many I read in the year? Or are these books enough to be truly worth celebrating? Did you have a 5-star book in 2022 that you'd like to let me know about? If so, leave a comment. I look forward to hearing from you. Anyhow, I hope you have a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.